Machiavelli once wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved, for love is held by bonds of obligation, which break at any opportunity for their own utility. But fear holds with a dread of punishment that never fails." I learned this the hard way when I was 28, fresh out of a relationship that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about attraction and power dynamics. Back then, I was the classic nice guy who believed that being constantly available and agreeable would win hearts. I'd drop everything for Sarah, my girlfriend at the time, cancel plans with friends, and basically orbit around her schedule like a satellite. I thought I was being romantic, but what I was actually doing was eliminating any mystery or challenge from our relationship. The wake-up call came during what should have been our 2-year anniversary dinner at this upscale Italian place in downtown Chicago. Sarah spent most of the evening texting and checking her phone, barely engaging in conversation. When I finally asked her what was going on, she said something that still echoes in my mind. "I don't know, Jake. You're just so predictable. I always know exactly how you'll react to everything." That night, I realized I'd made myself emotionally cheap. I was like a store that never closes and never raises prices. Convenient, but not valuable. The human brain, I discovered, has this attachment system that actually responds more intensely to uncertainty about reciprocity. When someone is constantly available, that system basically shuts down, killing the very attraction it was meant to create. I started studying the psychology behind this, diving into everything from Machiavelli to Robert Greene's work on power dynamics. I learned that Cleopatra wasn't the most beautiful woman in Egypt, but she understood something profound about scarcity and strategic timing. She didn't conquer Julius Caesar and Mark Antony through constant availability. She did it by alternating moments of intense connection with calculated distance. The research was fascinating, but I needed real-world application. So I began an experiment with my dating life, treating my attention like the valuable currency it actually is. Instead of texting back, immediately I'd wait. Instead of being free every weekend, I'd have other plans sometimes. Instead of agreeing with everything, I'd have my own opinions and stick to them. The results were almost immediate. Women who had previously seen me as just a friend suddenly became more interested. My colleague Amanda, who I'd been unsuccessfully pursuing for months, started initiating conversations after I stopped being her go-to emotional support system. Even Sarah, who by then was an ex, began reaching out more frequently. But here's the crucial part. This wasn't about playing games or being manipulative. It was about genuinely developing a life worth being curious about, having boundaries worth respecting, and maintaining the kind of self-respect that naturally creates respect in others. I wasn't pretending to be busy. I was actually building a life that was genuinely engaging. The corporate world taught me similar lessons. At my marketing firm, I noticed that the colleagues who got promoted weren't necessarily the most talented, but they were the ones who understood the economy of attention. They made their time feel valuable by being selective about meetings, strategic about when they shared ideas, and careful not to make themselves too available for every small request. Apple's entire business model is built on this principle. They don't flood the market with products. They create carefully orchestrated scarcity that makes each release an event. Meanwhile, companies like Kodak failed partly because they were always available to everyone with the same old technology, never creating the kind of exclusive desire that drives real passion. I remember testing this theory during my next performance review. Instead of immediately accepting the first offer my boss Michael made, I asked for 24 hours to consider it. That simple pause completely changed the dynamic of our negotiation, and I ended up with a 15% higher raise than initially offered. The transformation wasn't just external, it was internal too. When you start treating your own time and attention as valuable, you begin to see yourself differently. You move through the world with more confidence, make decisions from a place of abundance rather than scarcity, and naturally attract people who appreciate quality over constant availability. But mastering the economy of attention was just the beginning, because timing, as I was about to discover, would prove to be everything. Machiavelli observed that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. What he meant was that perception often matters more than reality, and nowhere is this truer than in the art of emotional scarcity. After learning to value my own attention, I discovered that timing when to give and withhold that attention was an entirely different skill set. I first understood this principle through a painful lesson with my business partner David back in 2020. We were launching a digital marketing consultancy together, and I made the classic mistake of being too eager, too available, too desperate to please every potential client. I'd respond to emails within minutes, take calls at all hours, and bend over backwards to accommodate every request, thinking this showed dedication and reliability. The result was exactly what Machiavelli would have predicted. Clients began treating our services like a commodity, constantly pushing for lower prices and expecting instant responses. One client, Jennifer, from a tech startup in Austin, would literally text me at midnight with random questions, knowing I'd respond immediately. Our perceived value plummeted because we acted like we had nothing better to do than wait around for their approval. David, on the other hand, had naturally grasped this concept. He'd take several hours to respond to emails, schedule calls only during specific windows, and never appeared desperate for any single client's business. Guess whose advice clients valued more? Whose time they treated with respect? It wasn't mine. I was learning that availability kills attraction, whether in romance or business. The turning point came when I implemented what I called my strategic delay system. Instead of responding to non-urgent communications immediately, I'd wait at least 2 hours, sometimes longer. I stopped being available for calls outside business hours and started saying no to projects that didn't align with our goals. The psychological effect was remarkable. Clients began perceiving our time as more valuable simply because it was less accessible. Jennifer, the midnight texter, transformed completely. Within 3 weeks of implementing boundaries, she stopped the late-night messages and started prefacing requests with, "When you have time," or "No rush on this." More importantly, she stopped questioning our fees and began referring other clients. The scarcity of my attention had paradoxically made it more valuable to her. I noticed the same principle working in my dating life. There was this woman, Lisa, who I'd met through a mutual friend at a rooftop party in Brooklyn. Initially, she seemed mildly interested, but not particularly engaged. However, when I started applying strategic scarcity, not liking every Instagram post, taking longer to respond to texts, having legitimate plans that didn't revolve around her, her interests skyrocketed. The neuroscience behind this fascinated me. I learned that dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for pleasure and motivation, increases by about 40% when rewards are uncertain, compared to only 10% when they're guaranteed. Lisa's brain was literally getting more pleasure from our interactions because she couldn't predict them completely. But here's where most people mess this up. They fake scarcity. They pretend to be busy when they're sitting at home doing nothing, or they play games for the sake of playing games. Real scarcity comes from genuinely having a life worth being curious about. I wasn't pretending to have other plans. I was actually building a business, maintaining friendships, and pursuing hobbies that fulfilled me. The key insight came during a networking event in Manhattan. I watched 2 entrepreneurs pitch to the same investor. The first guy was available anytime, promised immediate deliverables, and practically begged for a meeting. The second woman mentioned she had a narrow window next month, was selective about partnerships, and suggested they might not be the right fit. Guess who got the follow-up call? On social media, I started applying this ruthlessly. Instead of rapid-fire responses to every comment and message, I'd engage thoughtfully but sporadically. Instead of posting daily, I'd share something valuable, maybe twice a week. The engagement on my posts actually increased because people weren't taking my content for granted anymore. The corporate world validated this principle repeatedly. I noticed that consultants who charged premium rates and had waiting lists were often no more skilled than those who were always available at bargain prices. The difference wasn't ability, it was perceived value through controlled access. But as powerful as scarcity was proving to be, I was about to learn that without perfect timing, even the best strategy could backfire spectacularly. Machiavelli warned that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. This became crystal clear to me during what I now call the worst timing disaster of my career, a situation that taught me timing isn't just important, it's everything. Even Napoleon understood this, choosing exactly when to attack each enemy, never fighting two powers simultaneously, but dividing to conquer temporally. It was late 2021, and I was eyeing a senior marketing director position at a Fortune 500 company in Chicago. I'd been preparing for months, networking with the right people, and finally got the interview. But here's where I screwed up. I was so eager to impress that I pitched my biggest ideas during the first conversation, answered every question immediately, and basically showed all my cards before they'd even decided they wanted to play. The interview went well, or so I thought. They seemed impressed, nodded at the right moments, and said they'd be in touch soon. But days turned into weeks, and the silence was deafening. Finally, I got the rejection email. They'd gone with an internal candidate. I later learned through a mutual connection that while they liked my ideas, they felt I was too eager and might not handle pressure well, because I'd rushed through everything. That failure haunted me, especially when I watched how my mentor, James, handled a similar situation 6 months later. When a startup approached him for a consulting role, he didn't pitch immediately. Instead, he said, "Let me think about how I could add the most value to your specific situation and get back to you tomorrow." That simple pause completely changed the dynamic. Suddenly, they were selling themselves to him instead of the other way around. I realized I'd been violating what I started calling the 48-hour rule. Never respond to important proposals immediately, even if you know your answer. This isn't about playing games. It's about giving yourself time to craft the best response and signaling that your decision-making process is thoughtful, not reactive. Urgency from others is often just manufactured pressure designed to make you act against your best interests. The next opportunity came sooner than expected. A tech startup in Austin wanted me to head their marketing department, and this time I applied everything I'd learned. When they made the initial offer during our Zoom call, I thanked them and said, "This sounds exciting. Give me until Thursday to review everything properly and consider how I can deliver the most value." The difference in their response was night and day. Suddenly, I was the prize they were trying to win. But timing isn't just about delays. It's about reading the room and striking when emotions are right. During my negotiation with the Austin startup, I waited until they mentioned their biggest marketing challenge, then casually mentioned a similar problem I'd solved at my previous company. That wasn't coincidence. I'd researched their pain points and timed my revelation perfectly. I started applying this principle everywhere. In dating, instead of asking someone out the moment I felt interested, I'd wait for the right conversational opening when they were already engaged and enjoying our interaction. The success rate was dramatically different. Lisa, who I'd mentioned before, later told me she appreciated that I never seemed desperate or pushy. I'd learned to sense when she was receptive versus distracted. At work, I stopped volunteering for every project immediately. Instead, I'd listen to the full brief, ask thoughtful questions, and then say I needed to check my bandwidth before committing. Paradoxically, this made colleagues and supervisors more eager for my involvement, because my time seemed valuable and considered, not freely available to whoever asked first. The breakthrough moment came during a client presentation in Denver. Instead of launching into our pitch right away, I noticed the CEO seemed distracted and stressed. Rather than forge ahead, I said, "I can see you've got a lot on your plate. Would it be better to reschedule when you can give this your full attention?" He was so impressed by the consideration that we ended up having coffee instead, building a personal connection that led to a contract worth twice what we'd originally proposed. Steve Jobs mastered this at Apple keynotes. He'd build anticipation by appearing only at the crucial moment, making his presence feel like an event rather than a routine appearance. I started applying the same principle to meetings, arriving precisely on time rather than early, speaking only when my input would have maximum impact, and leaving conversations while they still wanted more. The psychology behind this fascinated me. When someone's emotions are heightened, whether through excitement, stress, or anticipation, they're more likely to make decisions and remember experiences vividly. I learned to recognize these emotional peaks in others and time my most important communications accordingly. But as I was mastering the when of influence, I discovered there was an even more powerful tool hiding in plain sight: the strategic use of vulnerability to create unbreakable bonds. Machiavelli observed that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. This became my secret weapon after I discovered that strategic vulnerability, showing carefully chosen weaknesses at precisely the right moments, could create deeper connections than any display of strength ever could. The key word here is strategic, because vulnerability without calculation is just emotional bleeding that repels people rather than drawing them closer. I learned this lesson through watching Oprah Winfrey build her media empire. She became one of the most powerful people in entertainment, not by appearing invulnerable, but by sharing specific traumas and insecurities that made her relatable while never compromising her authority. She'd reveal childhood abuse to connect with audiences, but she did it from a position of having overcome it, not while drowning in it. My first real test came during a job interview at a digital agency in San Francisco back in 2019. The usual approach would have been to present myself as flawless, but instead I chose a different path. When they asked about my biggest professional challenge, I shared how I'd initially struggled with public speaking, even admitting I'd thrown up before my first major presentation. But then I explained the systematic approach I'd developed to overcome it, showing them the growth trajectory rather than just the weakness. The response was immediate and powerful. The hiring manager, Rebecca, actually leaned forward and said, "I appreciate your honesty. Most candidates try to convince us they're perfect." I got the job, and she later told me that my willingness to show authentic struggle, combined with evidence of overcoming it, made me seem both human and resilient. Exactly what they wanted in a team leader. But here's where most people crash and burn with vulnerability. They dump everything all at once. I watched a colleague, Marcus, destroy his credibility during his first week by oversharing about his divorce, financial problems, and anxiety issues with anyone who'd listen. Instead of creating connection, he made people uncomfortable and worried about his stability. Vulnerability has to be earned and timed, not vomited onto unsuspecting listeners. I developed what I call the vulnerability ladder, a progression of carefully calibrated revelations. First level, charming imperfections like being terrible with directions or burning every meal I attempt to cook. Second level, Relatable insecurities like feeling nervous before important meetings or worrying about disappointing people I respect. Third level, deeper struggles, but only after trust is established and always paired with lessons learned or growth achieved. This worked incredibly well in dating. With Lisa, instead of pretending to be Mr. Perfect, I gradually revealed layers of myself. First, I mentioned how I'd embarrassingly gotten lost using GPS, trying to find our second date location. Later, I shared my anxiety about living up to my father's business success. Eventually, I opened up about struggling with imposter syndrome in my career. Each revelation was timed for maximum connection while maintaining respect. The neuroscience behind this fascinated me. When someone shares vulnerability, it activates our mirror neurons, creating empathetic connection. But too much vulnerability triggers our psychological flight response because our brains interpret it as a sign of genetic weakness or instability. The sweet spot is showing struggles that people can relate to while demonstrating the strength to handle them. I started applying this principle in business relationships too. During a negotiation with a potential client in Miami, instead of projecting invincibility, I mentioned that their project reminded me of an early mistake I'd made in digital strategy, then explained how that failure had taught me the exact framework we'd use to ensure their success. This admission of past imperfection actually increased their confidence in my current abilities. The corporate world validated this repeatedly. Leaders who admitted when they didn't know something and asked for input got more respect than those who pretended to have all the answers. My boss at the agency, Tom, once told me he trusted me more after I'd admitted uncertainty about a client's strategy and suggested we bring in additional expertise rather than wing it. But I also learned to recognize the warning signs of vulnerability overdose. When people started offering help I hadn't asked for, changing subjects quickly when I opened up, or looking uncomfortable during personal shares, I knew I'd crossed the line from strategic openness into emotional dumping. The goal is to create intimacy, not therapy sessions. The breakthrough came when I realized that controlled vulnerability isn't manipulation. It's actually more honest than the fake perfection most people project. By choosing to show my real struggles and growth, I was giving people permission to be authentic too, creating relationships built on truth rather than pretense. However, as powerful as strategic vulnerability proved to be, I was about to discover that the real masters of influence had learned to become human mirrors, reflecting people's best selves back to them. Machiavelli understood that men, for the most part, are simple and will obey present necessities. What he meant was that people are fundamentally driven by their immediate needs and desires, and the fastest way to fulfill those needs is to become a reflection of their idealized selves. I discovered this principle accidentally during a networking event in downtown Manhattan, and it changed everything about how I approach relationships, both personal and professional. I was at this tech conference mixer, feeling completely out of my element among all these startup founders and venture capitalists. There was this woman, Catherine, who clearly commanded respect in the room. People kept approaching her, hanging on her words, seeking her advice. I watched her interact for about 20 minutes before introducing myself, and what I noticed was fascinating. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, but somehow everyone wanted to impress her. When I finally worked up the courage to approach, instead of launching into my usual elevator pitch about my marketing background, I found myself mirroring her energy and communication style. She spoke thoughtfully with deliberate pauses, so I matched that rhythm. She asked probing questions about business models, so I responded with equally strategic inquiries about market positioning. Without consciously planning it, I'd become a complementary version of herself. The conversation lasted 45 minutes, longer than I'd seen her spend with anyone else that evening. Later, she actually sought me out to continue our discussion over coffee the following week. When I reflected on what had happened, I realized I'd unconsciously created what psychologists call unconscious rapport by becoming a mirror that reflected her own communication patterns and values back to her. Napoleon mastered this with Josephine, mirroring her Parisian sophistication while adding his own Corsican intensity. She saw in him a refined version of her own dramatic flair and social ambition. The key wasn't becoming her, it was becoming a complementary version that enhanced her own self-image. This is radically different from the shape-shifting that most people attempt, which comes across as fake and desperate. I started experimenting with this systematically in different contexts. With introverted colleagues, I'd match their more reflective energy and leave comfortable pauses in conversations. With high-energy extroverts, I'd mirror their enthusiasm while adding depth and substance they respected. With analytical types, I'd reflect their love of data while bringing creative applications they found intriguing. The results were remarkable, but I learned some crucial distinctions. When dealing with insecure people, I'd mirror their vulnerabilities, but with slightly more confidence and self-acceptance, showing them who they could become. With narcissistic personalities, I'd acknowledge their accomplishments while demonstrating that I had my own achievements, creating respect rather than worship. The goal was always to complement, never to compete or completely copy. My dating life transformed when I applied this principle with Lisa. Instead of trying to be someone I thought she'd like, I observed what she valued most in herself: creativity, independence, intellectual curiosity, and reflected those qualities back while adding my own flavor. When she talked about her photography passion, I didn't pretend to be an expert, but I asked questions that showed I understood the artistic vision behind technical skill. The breakthrough moment came during a client presentation in Seattle. The CEO, Richard, was clearly a perfectionist who valued precision and thorough preparation. Instead of my usual enthusiastic big-picture approach, I mirrored his methodical style, presenting detailed data and step-by-step implementation plans. But I added strategic creativity he admired but couldn't quite access himself. He not only approved our proposal, but asked if I'd be willing to consult on other projects. But here's where people often mess this up. They become perfect mirrors, which actually triggers suspicion and discomfort. I learned to maintain what I call the 70-30 rule. 70% mirroring their communication style and values, 30% authentic differentiation. People want to see improved versions of themselves, not exact copies that make them question your authenticity. The psychology behind this runs deep. Mirror neurons in our brains fire both when we perform an action and when we observe others performing the same action. When someone mirrors our behavior subtly, it creates subconscious comfort and connection. But when the mirroring is too obvious or complete, it activates our threat detection systems instead. I also learned to adapt my mirroring based on personality types. Anthony Weiner's political downfall came partly from his inability to mirror the family values he preached. The disconnect between his public persona and private behavior created cognitive dissonance that destroyed his credibility. Authenticity isn't about being completely yourself. It's about being the best version of yourself that resonates with your audience. But as powerful as becoming someone's ideal mirror proved to be, I was about to learn that controlling when and how much of myself I revealed could be even more influential. Machiavelli cautioned that a prince must be careful never to make himself hated or despised. Udin. I learned this lesson the hard way when I realized I'd been giving away my most valuable currency, attention, like it was worthless pocket change. Your attention is literally the only thing you own that everyone else wants, and whoever learns to distribute it strategically controls every relationship dynamic they enter. The wake-up call came through watching Jennifer Lawrence's career trajectory. Here's someone who conquered Hollywood not by being available for every interview, red carpet, event, or social media interaction, but by being incredibly selective. She'd refused 90% of the opportunities that came her way, making each appearance worth millions in buzz and increasing her per-event value exponentially. Meanwhile, celebrities who said yes to everything became white noise. I was doing the exact opposite in my own life. On Instagram, I'd like every single post from people I was interested in, usually within minutes of them posting. I'd respond to every text immediately, accept every social invitation, and basically signal that I had nothing more important going on than waiting for their next move. The result was predictable. I became background noise in everyone's life. My business partner David pointed this out during lunch at our usual spot in Chicago. "You know why that client Jennifer keeps pushing back on our rates?" he asked. "Because you respond to her emails in 30 seconds. She thinks we're sitting around with nothing to do except wait for her approval." He was right. I'd trained everyone in my professional network to treat my time as if it had no value. The transformation started with what I called strategic delays. Non-urgent emails got responses after at least 2 hours, sometimes longer. Text messages from potential romantic interests got thoughtful replies, but not immediate ones. Social media interactions became more deliberate. Instead of rapid fire, likes and comments, I'd engage meaningfully but sporadically, making my digital presence feel intentional rather than desperate. The psychological impact was immediate and powerful. Jennifer, the client who'd been jerking us around, suddenly started prefacing her requests with "when you get a chance" and "no rush on this." More importantly, she stopped questioning our fees and began referring other clients. The artificial scarcity of my attention had made it more valuable to her, creating respect where there had been assumption. In dating, the effect was even more dramatic. Lisa, who I'd been pursuing with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever, began initiating conversations for the first time after I stopped being her instant response system. When I started having genuine plans that didn't revolve around her availability, she began working around my schedule instead of expecting me to accommodate hers constantly. The neuroscience behind this fascinated me. Studies show that dopamine levels increase by 40% when rewards are uncertain, compared to only 10% when they're guaranteed. By making my attention less predictable, I was literally making interactions with me more neurochemically rewarding for other people. Their brains were getting more pleasure from our exchanges because they couldn't predict them completely. But here's the crucial distinction. This wasn't about playing games or being artificially unavailable. I genuinely started building a life worth being curious about. I wasn't pretending to be busy while sitting at home scrolling social media. I was actually starting new projects, deepening friendships, and pursuing interests that fulfilled me independently of anyone else's validation. The business world validated this principle repeatedly. Netflix conquered entertainment not by being constantly available like Blockbuster, but by creating controlled scarcity through strategic releases and binge-watching patterns they orchestrated. Meanwhile, companies that were always accessible became commodities, competing solely on price rather than value. I learned to vary the types of attention I offered too. Sometimes I'd give someone my complete focus during a conversation. Other times I'd be friendly but distracted. The unpredictability kept people more engaged than consistent availability ever had. My colleague Sarah later told me she'd started looking forward to our coffee meetings because she never knew if I'd be available for them. The breakthrough came when I realized that managing attention wasn't just about withholding it. It was about making it meaningful when I did offer it. When I finally did engage fully with someone, that attention felt precious rather than expected. People began competing for it rather than taking it for granted. fundamentally shifting the power dynamic in every relationship I had. But as I was mastering when to give and withhold attention, I discovered that controlling how people interpreted my actions would prove even more powerful. Machiavelli knew that he who controls the words controls the minds. I discovered this truth during what could have been the most embarrassing professional failure of my career, but instead became a masterclass in narrative control that changed how I approach every conflict, negotiation, and relationship challenge. It was spring of 2022, and I'd made a significant error in a client campaign that cost them about $15,000 in wasted ad spend. My first instinct was panic, followed by the typical corporate response: apologize profusely, accept blame, and hope for mercy. But something Franklin Roosevelt once said during the Great Depression stuck with me. He didn't just manage the crisis, he controlled how Americans understood the crisis through his fireside chats. Instead of calling the client immediately to grovel, I spent 2 hours crafting what I now call a narrative reframe. Rather than presenting this as my failure that hurt their business, I positioned it as valuable market research that revealed a crucial insight about their target demographic that would prevent much larger losses in future campaigns. Same facts, completely different story. When I finally called Robert, the marketing director, I led with, "I've discovered something important about your audience that's going to save us from making a much more expensive mistake down the line." Then I presented the failed campaign as a controlled test that revealed their customers responded differently than industry standards suggested, giving us competitive intelligence their competitors didn't have. His response was remarkable. Instead of anger, he became curious about what we'd learned. Instead of questioning our competence, he started asking how we could leverage this insight across other campaigns. By controlling the narrative around the mistake, I'd transformed a career-threatening error into a strategic discovery that actually strengthened our relationship. This principle applies everywhere, especially in romantic relationships. I learned this watching Nixon's Watergate downfall. He lost, not because of the facts, but because he allowed the media to define those facts as presidential corruption rather than national security concerns. Once you lose control of how your story is told, you lose control of how people respond to you. The technique that changed everything was what I call preemptive framing. Instead of waiting for others to interpret my actions, I'd define the meaning first. When I had to cancel a date with Lisa due to a work emergency, instead of just apologizing and hoping she wouldn't be upset, I framed it as, I have to handle something tonight that's going to set up a huge opportunity for us to do that weekend trip to Napa we talked about. In professional settings, I started using future pacing constantly. During team meetings, instead of just presenting problems, I'd paint pictures of what success would look like after we solved them. When we streamline this process, we'll free up 15 hours a week for strategic work. Hits differently than, "This process is inefficient and wastes time." But narrative control isn't just about spin. It's about recognizing that every situation has multiple valid interpretations, and the person who offers the most compelling version first usually wins. When my colleague Marcus was consistently late to morning meetings, instead of confronting him about time management, I reframed it as, "I know you're juggling a lot of priorities. How can we restructure these meetings to work better with your schedule?" The defensive techniques proved equally valuable. When someone tried to reframe me negatively, I learned to acknowledge their perspective while immediately offering my own. Interpretation backed by specific evidence. If a client suggested our timeline was unrealistic, I'd respond with, "I understand that seems aggressive. Here's why I believe it's not only achievable, but necessary for maximizing your launch window opportunity." What fascinated me was how people's emotional responses changed based on framing. The same delay could be seen as incompetence or thorough preparation depending on how it was presented. The same direct communication could be perceived as honesty or rudeness based on the narrative context I provided. I started applying this to everyday conflicts too. Instead of, "You never help with dishes," I'd try, "When we tag team on cleanup, we get so much more time to relax together." Same core message, but one frames the other person as a problem, while the other frames cooperation as an opportunity for mutual benefit. The real breakthrough came when I realized that controlling narratives wasn't manipulation. It was actually more honest than letting others impose their interpretations on my actions. By proactively explaining my intentions and framing situations positively, I was giving people accurate context rather than allowing them to fill in blanks with assumptions that might be completely wrong. However, as I was learning to shape how people interpreted my words and actions, I was about to discover that the real masters of influence understood something even more fundamental, the delicate dance between strength and vulnerability that keeps every relationship electrically alive. Machiavelli advised that it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares and a lion to terrify the wolves. This became my guide to understanding that every relationship, romantic, professional or social, has an underlying power dynamic, and pretending otherwise is the fastest way to lose respect and attraction. The key isn't dominating others, but knowing when to lead and when to follow, when to be vulnerable and when to be strong. I learned this lesson through watching Beyoncé's career evolution. She masters the art of alternating between moments of complete vulnerability, like in her album Lemonade, where she exposed her marriage struggles, and demonstrations of absolute power during her performances, where she commands stages like a general commanding armies. This constant shift between strength and openness keeps both her audience and Jay-Z fascinated because they never know which version they're getting. My own wake-up call came during a relationship with Rachel, a successful attorney I'd been dating for about 4 months in 2020. I'd fallen into the trap of being consistently agreeable, supportive, and accommodating. Basically playing the role of the perfect boyfriend who never created any friction or tension. I thought I was being loving, but what I was actually doing was eliminating all the psychological electricity that makes relationships exciting. The breaking point came during a weekend trip to Napa Valley. Every decision was mine to make. Where to eat, which wineries to visit, what time to wake up, because I'd positioned myself as the perpetual accommodator. Rachel finally snapped and said, "Can you please just have an opinion about something, anything? I feel like I'm dating a yes man, not a partner." That's when I realized that constant agreeability isn't attractive, it's exhausting for the other person. I started studying couples who maintained long-term passion, and the pattern was clear. They had complementary power dynamics that shifted based on context. The woman might lead social decisions while the man led financial ones, or one partner dominated career conversations while the other took charge of family planning. The key was that both people got to feel powerful in different areas, creating respect rather than resentment. At work, I noticed the same principle. My boss, Tom, was most effective when he alternated between collaborative leadership during brainstorming sessions and decisive authority when tough calls had to be made. Colleagues respected him because they experienced both his openness to input and his willingness to make hard decisions when consensus wasn't possible. I began experimenting with what I call situational leadership in my dating life. With Rachel, instead of defaulting to accommodation, I started taking charge in areas where I had expertise: restaurant choices, weekend activity planning, financial decisions, while yielding leadership to her in areas where she was stronger, like social dynamics and career strategy. The shift in her attraction was immediately noticeable. The corporate world validated this repeatedly. During client presentations, I'd start by asking thoughtful questions and listening carefully to their concerns, showing the fox side that Machiavelli referenced. But when it came time to present solutions, I'd shift into confident, decisive mode, the lion that commands respect. Clients responded far better to this dynamic range than to consistently passive or aggressive approaches. But here's the crucial insight. This isn't about manipulation or game playing. It's about recognizing that attraction requires polarity, and relationships where everyone tries to be equal in everything often lose their sexual and emotional charge. Men who are always nice guys and women who are always accommodating eliminate the tension that keeps passion alive over time. I learned to read the room and adjust accordingly. With confident, dominant personalities, I'd mirror their energy while adding strategic moments of vulnerability that made them feel safe to be open. With more submissive types, I'd take more leadership while creating space for them to express their own strengths and opinions. The goal was always complementary dynamics, not competition. The breakthrough came when I realized that healthy power dynamics aren't about one person always being in control, but about both people feeling empowered in different ways at different times. Rachel later told me that our relationship became much more exciting once I stopped trying to be perfect and started being decisive, even when that meant occasional disagreement or conflict. The psychology behind this is fundamental. Our brains are wired to seek out complementary partnerships where different strengths can combine synergistically. When both people try to play the same role all the time, it creates psychological friction rather than attraction. But as I was mastering this dance between strength and flexibility, I discovered that managing what people expected from me would determine whether these power dynamics worked in my favor or against me. Machiavelli observed that promises are made to be broken when they no longer serve the prince. While that sounds cynical, what he really meant was that managing expectations is more important than making grand gestures, and the secret to lasting influence is consistently delivering slightly more than you promise, while never promising more than you can deliver. Winston Churchill mastered this during World War II by promising the British people only blood, toil, tears and sweat, then delivering victory against impossible odds. Meanwhile, politicians who promise the moon and stars during campaigns inevitably disappoint when reality fails to match their rhetoric. I learned this lesson during the most important negotiation of my career, and it completely changed how I approach every commitment I make. It was late 2021, and I was interviewing for a creative director position at a boutique agency in Los Angeles. The standard approach would have been to oversell my capabilities and promise immediate transformation of their struggling digital department. Instead, I took a page from Churchill's playbook and deliberately undersold while over-delivering on everything I could control in real time. When they asked about timeline expectations for turning around their social media performance, instead of promising rapid results, I said, realistically, you should expect to see meaningful engagement improvements in 90 days, with significant ROI changes happening around the 6-month mark. Then, during the interview process itself, I delivered a detailed analysis of their current strategy and specific improvement recommendations, giving them immediate value they hadn't expected. The psychological impact was profound. By setting conservative timelines while delivering unexpected immediate insights, I positioned myself as someone who underpromises and over-delivers, rather than someone who makes unrealistic commitments. They offered me the position with a salary 15% higher than advertised because I'd already exceeded their expectations during the interview process. I started applying this principle systematically across all areas of my life. In dating, instead of promising elaborate romantic gestures I might not have time or money to execute, I'd suggest simple activities, then surprise with thoughtful details that elevated the experience. When I told Lisa we'd grab coffee and catch up, but showed up with her favorite pastry from a bakery across town, that small surprise hit harder than a fancy dinner she was expecting. The corporate world validated this approach repeatedly. Ryan Reynolds built his relationship with Blake Lively by initially suggesting just a fun, no-pressure hangout, then delivering an experience so engaging she never forgot it. He managed expectations downward while exceeding them in execution, creating positive emotional associations with his presence, rather than disappointment from unmet promises. But here's where most people mess this up. They think under-promising means being boring or unambitious. The trick is setting realistic timeline expectations while being creative and thoughtful about execution. When my team was tasked with a challenging client rebrand, I told the stakeholders to expect initial concepts in 2 weeks, then delivered 3 strong directions in 10 days, along with competitive analysis they hadn't requested. I learned to recognize the warning signs of expectation inflation in myself. Whenever I felt tempted to promise something impressive to gain immediate approval or excitement, I'd pause and ask whether I could guarantee delivery. If there was any doubt, I'd scale back the promise while looking for ways to add unexpected value during the process itself. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. When expectations aren't met, our brains release cortisol and create negative associations with whoever disappointed us. But when expectations are exceeded, even slightly, we get dopamine hits that create positive emotional bonds. By consistently managing this brain chemistry in others, I was literally training people to feel good about interacting with me. My dating life transformed once I stopped trying to impress with big promises and started delivering small, consistent surprises. Lisa told me months later that she'd been on dates with guys who promised amazing experiences that turned out mediocre, but I was the first person who promised simple evenings that consistently became memorable ones. The business applications were endless. Instead of promising clients dramatic revenue increases, I'd focus on specific, measurable improvements in their marketing metrics, then find ways to exceed those targets through extra research, additional creative concepts, or bonus consulting sessions that weren't in our original scope. The breakthrough insight came when I realized that expectation management isn't about lowering standards. It's about building trust through reliability and creating joy through positive surprises. People don't remember the size of your promises. They remember whether you kept them and how you made them feel in the process. But as I was learning to create positive emotional associations through exceeded expectations, I discovered that without clear consequences for crossing my boundaries, even the best relationships would eventually take advantage of my consistency. Machiavelli warned that men must be either pampered or annihilated. They avenge themselves of lighter injuries, but cannot do so of greater ones. This taught me that love without boundaries becomes disrespect, and relationships without consequences inevitably become one-sided. The key isn't being cruel. It's being clear about what you will and won't tolerate, then following through consistently. I learned this the hard way through watching Vince Lombardi transform the Green Bay Packers from mediocre to legendary. He didn't motivate through fear or anger, but through absolute consistency in his consequences. Players respected him because they knew exactly what to expect. Clear rules, fair enforcement, and proportional responses to both success and failure. That predictability in standards created trust rather than resentment. My wake-up call came during a relationship with Amanda, a marketing executive I'd been seeing for about 6 months. She had a pattern of showing up 20 to 30 minutes late for everything: dinners, movies, even my birthday celebration. I'd express mild frustration, she'd apologize sweetly, and then repeat the exact same behavior the following week. I was inadvertently teaching her that my time had no real value. The breaking point came when she arrived 45 minutes late to a dinner reservation I'd made weeks in advance at an upscale restaurant in Manhattan. Instead of my usual frustrated acceptance, I simply said, "I can see you're dealing with some scheduling challenges. I'm going to head home tonight. Let me know when you've figured out a way to prioritize our time together." Then I left. Her response was immediate and revealing. She called 3 times that evening, sent long apologetic texts, and actually showed up at my apartment the next morning with coffee and a genuine plan for better time management. The consequence had accomplished what months of conversations couldn't. It forced her to confront the real impact of her behavior rather than just offering surface-level apologies. I started developing what I call escalating consequence systems for different types of relationships. In professional settings, the progression was direct conversation, documented follow-up, reduced collaboration, formal intervention, and finally, termination of working relationship. Each step was proportional and predictable, giving people multiple chances to course correct before facing serious repercussions. With friends and family, the consequences were more about emotional boundaries than professional ones. When my brother consistently borrowed money without repaying it, I stopped lending entirely rather than continuing the cycle of resentment. When a friend repeatedly flaked on plans, I stopped making them and shifted to more casual, last-minute interactions where his unreliability couldn't disappoint me. The psychology behind this is fundamental. Behavior that gets rewarded continues, and behavior without consequences escalates. By tolerating disrespect, even minor forms, I was actually training people to disrespect me more over time. Clear boundaries with consistent enforcement create safety for everyone because people know exactly where they stand. But here's the crucial distinction between healthy consequences and toxic punishment. Consequences should be natural extensions of the boundary violation, not arbitrary punishments designed to cause pain. When Amanda was chronically late, the natural consequence was that I stopped waiting around. When clients consistently pushed deadlines, the natural consequence was that their projects got deprioritized for clients who respected our process. I learned to apply consequences elegantly by focusing on my own behavior rather than trying to punish others. Instead of saying you're being disrespectful, I'd say I'm going to focus my energy elsewhere today. Instead of you're taking advantage of me, I'd say I need to reevaluate how I'm spending my time. This approach maintained dignity for both parties while still creating clear cause and effect relationships. The corporate world provided countless examples. Companies that consistently gave raises to employees who threatened to quit trained their entire workforce to become flight risks. Meanwhile, organizations with clear performance standards and consistent consequences created cultures where excellence was rewarded and mediocrity had natural limitations. My relationship with Amanda completely transformed once she realized I had boundaries with teeth. She not only became punctual, but started respecting my time in ways she never had before. More importantly, she told me she actually felt more secure in the relationship because she knew where I stood, rather than wondering when my patience would finally run out. The breakthrough came when I understood that consequences aren't about control. They're about self-respect and creating healthy relationship dynamics where both people understand the rules of engagement. People actually feel safer when they know your boundaries because it eliminates the anxiety of wondering what might eventually push you too far. But as I was mastering the art of maintaining boundaries through consequences, I started recognizing another crucial skill, knowing exactly when to walk away before relationships became too damaged to save. Machiavelli taught that he who abandons before being abandoned always wins. This principle haunted me until I learned that knowing when to end relationships, whether romantic, professional, or personal, is more valuable than knowing how to start them. Most people cling to dying connections until they become bitter, resentful versions of themselves. Masters of strategy recognize when the curve is descending and exit at the peak. I watched Dave Chappelle demonstrate this perfectly when he walked away from his Comedy Central show at its absolute height, leaving $50 million on the table. Everyone called him crazy, but he understood something profound about timing and legacy. He returned years later on his own terms with Netflix specials that cemented his status as a comedy legend. Meanwhile, comedians who overstayed their welcome became punchlines themselves. My own lesson came through a business partnership that should have ended 2 years before it actually did. Marcus and I had built a successful digital marketing consultancy, but by 2022, we'd grown in completely different directions. He wanted to scale aggressively and take on any client with a budget, while I preferred working with fewer, higher quality clients who aligned with our values. Instead of recognizing this fundamental incompatibility, I kept trying to make it work. The warning signs were everywhere. Our meetings became repetitive arguments about strategy. We stopped collaborating creatively and started just dividing tasks mechanically. And worst of all, I found myself dreading Monday mornings for the first time in years. But I was trapped by sunk cost fallacy, thinking about all the time and energy we'd invested, rather than honestly evaluating whether the partnership was still serving either of us. I started developing what I call quarterly relationship audits, systematic evaluations of whether my connections were still contributing to mutual growth. The questions were brutal but necessary. Does this relationship still challenge me to become better? Am I investing more energy than I'm receiving consistently? Can I genuinely see myself in this dynamic 2 years from now? What opportunities am I missing by maintaining this status quo? The Marcus situation crystallized during a client meeting in Chicago, where we presented completely contradictory strategies to the same prospect. The embarrassment was profound, but more importantly, I realized we'd become professional strangers who happened to share a business bank account. That night, I finally initiated the conversation we should have had 18 months earlier. Michael Jordan provided the perfect counterexample. His return to basketball with the Washington Wizards tarnished a perfect legacy and turned him from untouchable icon into aging athlete struggling to keep up. He stayed 2 years too long, and instead of being remembered solely for his championship dominance, he became a cautionary tale about knowing when to walk away. I learned to recognize the subtle signs that relationships had entered terminal decline, conversations becoming repetitive and surface level, conflicts increasing without meaningful resolution, personal growth stopping or regressing when spending time together, and most tellingly, feeling relief rather than excitement when plans got cancelled. These weren't temporary rough patches. They were fundamental shifts that required honest acknowledgement. The process I developed for elegant exits became a framework I used across all relationships. First, honest recognition of the situation without blame or shame. Second, direct communication about incompatibilities rather than personality attacks. Third, a defined transition period that respected the history we'd shared. Fourth, maintaining dignity for both parties throughout the process. Finally, complete emotional closure before moving forward. My dating life transformed once I stopped clinging to relationships that had run their natural course. With Sarah, a marketing director I'd been seeing casually for several months, I recognized that our connection had plateaued at friendship with occasional physical chemistry. Instead of letting it drag on and potentially turn bitter, I had an honest conversation about how we both seemed to be looking for different things and we transitioned to genuine friendship that lasted much longer than the romantic component ever could have. The corporate applications were equally valuable. I learned to recognize when projects, jobs, or professional relationships were past their expiration dates, rather than grinding through months or years of diminishing returns. My last corporate position ended when I realized I was staying for financial security rather than professional fulfillment. A sure sign that it was time to transition to full-time entrepreneurship. The psychological insight that changed everything was understanding that ending relationships at the right time preserves positive memories and often enables future reconnection on better terms. Endings that happen too late create resentment and toxicity that becomes permanent. Marcus and I eventually reconnected as friends 2 years after dissolving our partnership, something that wouldn't have been possible if we'd let the business relationship decay completely first. But as I was mastering the art of strategic exits, I realized that all these individual principles, scarcity, timing, vulnerability, mirroring, attention control, narrative management, power dynamics, expectation setting, consequences, and exit timing, needed to be woven together into a comprehensive approach to relationships that elevated everyone involved rather than just serving my own interests. Machiavelli understood that a prince who builds his foundation on the people will always find himself secure, because one who commands and has no fear of the people is truly free. After years of applying these principles individually, I discovered that the ultimate goal isn't manipulation. It's creating relationships where everyone feels empowered through healthy dynamics of mutual influence and respect. The transformation became clear through a complete case study that played out over 18 months with someone I'll call Elena, a successful architect I met at a networking event in Austin. From our first conversation, I unconsciously applied every principle we've discussed, but in service of genuine connection rather than conquest. The result was a relationship that elevated both of us professionally and personally. Our initial interaction demonstrated scarcity and timing perfectly. Instead of trying to extend our first conversation indefinitely, I engaged intensely for exactly 20 minutes. Then mentioned I had another commitment and suggested we continue over coffee sometime. The strategic vulnerability came during our second meeting when I shared my initial nervousness about transitioning from corporate marketing to entrepreneurship, paired immediately with the concrete steps I was taking to build my consultancy. The mirroring happened naturally because I genuinely listened during our first conversation. Elena valued precision and creative problem-solving in her architectural work, so I reflected those same qualities when discussing my approach to digital strategy, while adding the marketing creativity she found intriguing but couldn't quite access in her own field. I wasn't becoming her, I was becoming a complementary version that enhanced her self-image. My attention economy played out over months. I never liked every LinkedIn post or responded to every text immediately, but when I did engage, it was thoughtful and substantial. I had genuine projects and interests that meant I wasn't always available, but when I was present, she had my complete focus. This created the dopamine variability that kept our interactions neurochemically rewarding rather than predictable. The narrative control emerged during our first real conflict, about 6 months in. Elena had made a commitment to attend my company's launch event, then had to cancel due to a client emergency. Instead of framing this as her choosing work over me, I positioned it as both of us being dedicated professionals who understood that sometimes business demands flexibility in personal plans. This reframe turned a potential relationship crisis into mutual respect for each other's career priorities. Our power dynamics shifted situationally in exactly the way healthy relationships should. Elena took the lead on travel planning and social situations where her architectural eye for design and detail created amazing experiences. I led financial discussions and business strategy conversations where my marketing background added value to her practice. Neither of us was always dominant or always submissive. We were complementary leaders. The expectation management happened consistently throughout our relationship. Instead of promising elaborate romantic gestures I might not have time to execute, I'd suggest simple activities, then surprise with thoughtful details. When I said we'd grab dinner and catch up, I'd show up having researched 3 restaurant options based on her mood that day, turning a casual evening into something memorable without over-promising up front. When boundaries needed consequences, I applied them elegantly and proportionally. Elena had a habit of making plans, then changing them last minute based on work demands. Instead of arguing about it, I simply stopped making reservations or buying advance tickets until she demonstrated more consistency. The natural consequence shifted her behavior without creating resentment, because I focused on protecting my own time rather than punishing hers. The relationship naturally ended after about 18 months when Elena got an incredible opportunity to work on a major project in Barcelona. Instead of trying to make long-distance work or pressuring her to stay, I recognized this as the perfect exit timing. We celebrated her opportunity, had honest conversations about what we'd meant to each other, and transitioned to friendship with genuine respect intact. 2 years later, when Elena returned from Spain, we reconnected professionally and personally on an even stronger foundation. She referred architectural clients who needed marketing strategy. I connected her with developers looking for innovative design. We occasionally grab coffee and catch up, maintaining the connection without trying to recreate the romantic component that had run its natural course. The integration of all 12 principles created something neither manipulation nor naive niceness could achieve. A relationship that genuinely elevated both people involved. Elena later told me I was the first person she'd dated who made her feel simultaneously challenged and accepted, supported and independent. That's the true goal of strategic relationship management, making others feel more powerful and authentic in your presence, not less. The final insight that ties everything together is this. These principles work because they align with how human psychology actually functions rather than fighting against it. We're attracted to scarcity because it signals value. We respond to timing because our emotions fluctuate. We connect through vulnerability because it activates empathy. We mirror because it creates unconscious rapport. We value attention because it's genuinely limited. We believe narratives because stories shape reality. We need power dynamics because polarity creates chemistry. We appreciate exceeded expectations because they trigger positive emotions. We respect consequences because they create safety. We remember good endings because they preserve positive associations. Master these principles not to control others, but to become someone others genuinely want to be around. The paradox of strategic relationships is that the more skillfully you apply influence, the less you need to use it, because people naturally gravitate toward those who understand and honor the psychological principles that govern all human connection. Your greatest power isn't making people do what you want. It's becoming someone they're genuinely excited to choose.